The hall was full that evening with people standing close together and talking in low voices while waiting for the program to continue. And it was the kind of place where the lights felt warm and the air carried a soft mix of perfume and old wood. The piano sat near the front, polished and quiet as if it was resting after a long day, and many in the crowd had already walked past it without a second look. This was not meant to be a concert by a child, and no one came expecting a surprise like that. Most people believed they were there to hear adults who had trained for years, and who understood the weight of performing in front of strangers. Near the back of the room, a small girl stood beside an older woman who was likely her mother or aunt, and she held her hands together while shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She was younger than many there, and her shoes looked new as if they had been worn only once or twice. Her eyes moved across the room, slowly taking everything in without saying much. She did not look nervous, yet she did not look excited either, and she seemed calm in a way that made her age easy to forget. Those close to her noticed she kept glancing toward the piano and then back down at the floor, as if she was thinking about something she had not shared with anyone. The event itself had reached a quiet moment when one of the organizers spoke to the crowd about music and community, and the idea that talent can appear in unexpected places. It sounded like a simple message meant to fill time, yet it planted a seed in the minds of those listening. Someone near the front noticed the girl and whispered to a friend about her small hands and focused expression. Another person joined the conversation, and soon a few heads turned in her direction. There was no plan and no script for what followed, and that was part of what made it feel real and unpolished. A man from the group stepped forward and asked the older woman if the girl played the piano. The question was asked gently and without pressure, yet it carried curiosity that was hard to ignore. The woman hesitated for a moment, and then nodded while explaining that the girl practiced at home and had lessons, but had never played in front of a crowd like this. The man smiled and looked back at the piano and then at the audience as if weighing a decision. A few people nearby heard the exchange and encouraged the idea with quiet words and supportive looks. The girl listened closely as the adults spoke about her, and she felt a mix of confusion and awareness. She understood they were talking about her playing, yet she had not been prepared for this moment. Her heart beat faster, yet her face stayed calm and her posture straight. When the question reached her, she nodded slowly and said yes in a soft voice that barely carried beyond those standing close. There was no dramatic reaction from her, and no sign of fear that others might expect from someone so young. The crowd began to shift and make space as the idea spread that the girl might play. Some people smiled while others looked unsure, and a few crossed their arms as if questioning whether this was a good idea. The organizer paused and then agreed to let the moment happen, believing that music did not always need strict rules. The piano bench was adjusted, and the path to the front cleared without anyone giving commands. Everything happened through shared understanding and quiet agreement. As the girl walked toward the piano, the room grew still in a natural way, and conversations faded without anyone asking for silence. She climbed onto the bench with help from the man who first noticed her, and her feet did not quite reach the floor. She took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys gently, as if greeting an old friend. The piano did not make a sound yet, and that silence carried more weight than noise. At that moment, no one in the room knew what would happen next, and expectations were low yet open. Some thought they would hear a few simple notes and then polite applause, while others sensed there might be something more. The girl looked at the keys with focus and familiarity, and her small fingers hovered in place, ready to begin. The room waited together, sharing a single quiet moment before the first note was played. The first sound came softly, and it surprised everyone because it was steady and confident rather than unsure. The girl pressed the keys with care, and the piano responded with a clear tone that filled the room gently. It was not loud and it was not rushed, and the notes moved in a way that felt intentional, as if she knew exactly where she was going. People who had been standing casually began to straighten their posture and turn their full attention toward her without realizing it. Even those who had doubted the idea of letting a child play found themselves listening closely. As the melody continued, the girl settled into her place on the bench, and her shoulders relaxed. Her hands moved smoothly across the keys, and her fingers curved naturally, showing hours of practice that had taken place far from this room. She did not look at the crowd, and she did not look around for approval. Her eyes stayed on the piano, and her expression remained calm and focused. It was clear that in this moment the rest of the room no longer existed for her, and she was playing the way she always did at home. The music grew richer as the piece developed, and the sound carried evenly through the hall. Conversations had fully stopped, and even the smallest movements in the crowd seemed to pause. A man near the front lowered his phone, realizing that recording felt less important than simply listening. A woman who had been tired from standing all evening felt her chest tighten slightly as the melody stirred something familiar and emotional inside her. No one spoke and no one shifted their feet, because the room had entered a shared state of attention that felt rare and fragile. The girl moved through the piece without hesitation, and when she reached a more complex section, her hands adjusted with quiet confidence. There was no sign of struggle or uncertainty, and no wrong notes that caused her to stop or correct herself. Instead, she flowed forward, trusting her memory and her instinct. Those who understood music recognized that this was not a beginner performance, and those who did not still felt the weight of the sound and the sincerity behind it. Her small size made the moment feel even more powerful, because the sound coming from the piano seemed far larger than anyone expected. The contrast between her age and the depth of the music created a sense of wonder that spread through the crowd. People exchanged brief glances that said more than words could, as if they were silently agreeing that they were witnessing something special. The piano no longer felt like just an instrument, but like a voice telling a story through her hands. The older woman who had come with the girl stood quietly near the back and watched with a mix of pride and disbelief. She had heard this music many times at home, yet hearing it here felt different and heavier. She noticed how the crowd leaned in and how the air itself felt still and respectful. Tears formed in her eyes, not because the girl was perfect, but because she was brave enough to play honestly in front of strangers. As the music continued, the emotional tone of the room shifted from curiosity to deep connection. People were no longer thinking about the event schedule or the people around them. They were fully present with the sound and with the child creating it. The piano notes rose and fell and carried a feeling of hope and tenderness that touched everyone differently, yet united them in the same experience. It was the kind of moment that could not be planned and could not be repeated in the same way. When the girl reached the final section of the piece, her movements became slightly more expressive yet still controlled. She leaned into the keys just enough to give the notes warmth and clarity. Her breathing stayed steady and her focus never broke. The room felt like it was holding its breath together, waiting for the ending without rushing it. No one wanted to interrupt what was unfolding naturally. As the last notes approached, there was a sense that something meaningful was coming to a close, yet no one felt ready for it to end. The girl slowed slightly and let the final sounds ring out fully, allowing the piano to speak until the sound faded on its own. Her hands rested on the keys for a moment longer, and she stayed still, absorbing the silence that followed. The room remained quiet, not out of confusion, but out of respect and awe, as everyone realized they had just shared a moment that would stay with them long after the night was over. The silence after the final note felt heavy yet gentle, and no one moved right away because it seemed important to protect what had just happened. The girl slowly lifted her hands from the keys and looked down at them as if making sure they were real. Her shoulders rose and fell with a quiet breath, and she stayed seated, unsure of what was expected next. She did not smile or bow because she had never learned how to end a moment like this. She only knew how to finish the music and wait. For a few seconds, the room stayed completely still, and then a single person began to clap softly. The sound broke the silence carefully, and others followed one by one. The applause grew not as an explosion, but as a wave that spread naturally through the crowd. People stood straighter and turned fully toward the piano. Some smiled openly while others wiped their eyes without embarrassment. The sound of clapping filled the hall, yet it did not feel loud or chaotic. It felt warm and sincere. The girl looked up when she realized the applause was for her, and confusion crossed her face before turning into a small, shy smile. She glanced toward the older woman at the back of the room and saw her nod with pride and encouragement. That simple gesture grounded her and helped her understand that she had done something good. She slid carefully off the bench with help and stood beside the piano, feeling smaller than before yet strangely lighter. Several people near the front leaned forward as if wanting to say something but unsure of the right words. No one rushed toward her and no one tried to lift her or put her on display. There was an unspoken agreement to treat the moment gently. The organizer stepped closer and thanked her in a calm voice that matched the mood of the room. He did not praise her excessively or make promises about her future. He simply acknowledged the beauty of what she had shared. The applause slowly faded, and the crowd settled back into quiet conversation, yet the energy had changed. People spoke more softly and with more intention. Strangers exchanged brief comments about the music and about how unexpected the moment had been. Some admitted they had not expected much and were surprised by how deeply they were moved. Others said very little because they were still processing the feeling that lingered in their chest. The girl returned to the older woman and stood close to her side. She listened as people nearby spoke kindly about her playing. Each word felt strange because she was not used to being talked about like that. At home, she practiced and finished and went on with her day. Here, her music had stopped time for a room full of people, and she was only beginning to understand what that meant. She held the woman's hand tightly as if anchoring herself to something familiar. A man who had been doubtful earlier now stood quietly with his arms relaxed and his expression thoughtful. He admitted to someone beside him that he had been wrong to underestimate the moment. The honesty of the performance had changed his perspective and reminded him of why he loved music in the first place. That realization stayed with him longer than the sound itself, and he knew he would remember it the next time he felt cynical or distracted. The piano remained at the front of the room still and silent, yet it no longer felt ordinary. People glanced at it as they passed with a new sense of respect, as if it held a memory that could not be erased. The bench was slightly out of place from where it had been earlier, and no one rushed to fix it. Leaving it that way felt like leaving proof that something real had occurred. As the event continued with its planned schedule, the atmosphere never fully returned to what it had been before. The surprise of the girl's performance lingered in the background and colored everything that followed. Even skilled adult performers who came after her felt the difference, and some played with more vulnerability, because they had been reminded that music was not about perfection, but about honesty. The girl herself remained quiet for the rest of the evening. She did not talk about the performance or ask questions about what it meant. She simply observed the room with a slightly different gaze. Something inside her had shifted, though she could not name it yet. She had learned that the music she loved in private could touch others deeply, and that knowledge rested in her gently like a seed waiting for time to help it grow later that evening. As the crowd began to thin the girl, and the older woman remained near the edge of the room watching people leave slowly. Several guests paused as they passed and offered quiet words of thanks or simple smiles. No one asked for her name or tried to turn her into a symbol of talent. They spoke to her as they would to anyone who had shared something meaningful. The girl listened politely and nodded, unsure how to respond, yet she felt a warmth from their kindness that stayed with her. When they finally stepped outside, the night air felt cool and grounding. The sounds of the city were softer than usual, and the lights reflected gently on the pavement. The girl walked beside the older woman, holding her hand and matching her pace. Neither of them spoke right away because there was no need to rush into words. The moment inside still felt close, and speaking too quickly might disturb it. As they walked, the older woman asked how she felt, and the girl thought carefully before answering. She said it felt different from playing at home and different from lessons. She said the room felt quiet in a way that made her feel safe even though there were many people. The older woman listened closely and smiled, because she understood that the girl was describing something important even if she did not have the language for it yet. At home later that night, the girl sat at the same piano she practiced on every day. The room was smaller and the walls were familiar, yet something about the instrument felt changed. She touched the keys lightly and played a few notes, not as practice but as memory. She remembered the way the sound had filled the hall and the way the silence afterward had felt full rather than empty. It made her realize that music could carry more than sound, and that realization stayed with her. The older woman watched from the doorway without interrupting. She had always supported the lessons and the routine, yet now she saw the music differently. It was no longer just a skill to develop or a habit to maintain. It was a voice the girl could use when words were not enough. That understanding made her more patient and more careful about how she guided her in the future. Over the next few days, the girl returned to her normal routine of school and practice. Nothing dramatic changed on the surface, and no one at school knew what had happened. She did not tell her classmates, and she did not feel the need to. Yet when she sat at the piano, her posture was slightly more confident and her focus deeper. She played with the same discipline, but with a new sense of purpose, as if she now understood why the hours mattered. Her teacher noticed the change during their next lesson. There was no sudden leap in skill, but there was a clarity in her playing that had not been there before. The teacher asked gently if something had happened recently, and the girl shrugged and said she had played for some people. The teacher nodded without pressing for details, sensing that the experience belonged to the girl and did not need to be explained fully. Word of the moment slowly traveled through the community, though it was not shared loudly or online. People spoke about it in small conversations and remembered it as something simple and honest. There were no recordings passed around and no exaggerated stories. That kept the memory intact and allowed it to remain personal for those who were there. For the girl, the experience settled quietly into her life. It did not push her toward ambition or fear. Instead, it gave her a calm confidence that came from knowing she could connect with others through music. She did not feel special or different from before, yet she felt capable in a way that was new and steady. As weeks passed, the night of the performance became a reference point she returned to without forcing it. When practice felt hard, she remembered the silence of the room and the way people listened. That memory reminded her that music had meaning beyond mistakes and perfection. It reminded her that sharing something honest could be enough, and that understanding began to shape not only how she played, But how she saw herself as time moved forward, the girl began to notice how music followed her into places beyond the piano bench. When she listened to sounds around her, she paid more attention than before. The rhythm of footsteps, the hum of distant traffic, and even quiet moments at home began to feel connected to the way she played. Music no longer lived only in practice sessions, but in the way she experienced the world. This change was subtle and steady, and it did not overwhelm her, yet it shaped how she focused and how she listened. At school, she remained quiet and observant as she always had been. Her teachers noticed that she concentrated deeply during lessons and that she approached tasks with patience. When group activities involved music or rhythm, she participated more confidently without drawing attention to herself. She did not seek praise and she did not compare herself to others. The confidence she carried was internal and calm rather than visible and loud. At home, practice continued to be part of her daily routine, yet it no longer felt like an obligation she had to push through. She still worked on technique and corrected mistakes, yet she approached each piece with curiosity rather than pressure. When she struggled, she paused and listened rather than forcing her way through. The piano became a place where she could think and feel freely without needing to explain herself. The older woman supported this change by adjusting how she encouraged the girl. She stopped reminding her of competitions or future goals and focused instead on consistency and enjoyment. She listened more closely when the girl spoke about how certain pieces made her feel. This shift created a stronger sense of trust between them and allowed the girl to explore music without fear of disappointing anyone. Occasionally, someone from the event would cross paths with them and mention the night in passing. These moments were brief and respectful. The girl would smile politely and then move on. She did not relive the moment often, and she did not want it to define her. It existed as a quiet milestone rather than a story she needed to repeat. Her teacher began to introduce more expressive pieces, not because of the performance, but because the girl seemed ready for them. The lessons became less about speed and accuracy and more about tone and intention. The girl responded naturally and learned to shape phrases with care. She listened deeply to the sound she created and adjusted her touch with awareness that came from experience rather than instruction. One afternoon during a lesson, the teacher asked her why she liked playing the piano. The girl thought for a long moment and said it helped her understand things she could not explain. The teacher nodded and did not ask further questions. That simple answer revealed more maturity than the teacher expected and confirmed that the girl was developing her own relationship with music. The memory of the night continued to surface in quiet ways. Sometimes it appeared when she heard applause during a school assembly. Other times it came back during silence after finishing a piece at home. These reminders did not bring pressure or expectation. They brought reassurance that sharing something honest could reach others without effort or display. As the year progressed, opportunities appeared naturally. Invitations to small gatherings and community events came through gentle conversations rather than announcements. Each time the girl was asked, she was given the choice without pressure. Sometimes she agreed and sometimes she declined. Knowing she could say no made saying yes feel safe and meaningful. Through all of this, the girl remained grounded in her everyday life. She laughed with friends, completed homework, and played quietly at home. Music stayed at the center of her routine without taking over her identity. It became a steady companion rather than a spotlight. What grew most from the experience was not ambition, but understanding. The girl learned that moments of connection could happen when least expected, and that being prepared allowed her to meet them with calm. That lesson extended beyond music and into how she approached new situations. She learned to trust her preparation and to remain open to what followed without trying to control it. Remain open to what followed without trying to control it. As the girl grew older, her hands became stronger and her reach across the keys widened. Yet she carried the same gentle approach she had always had. She did not rush to prove herself, and she did not feel the need to impress anyone. Music remained a private language first and a shared one second. That balance kept her grounded as expectations around her slowly increased. People began to notice her consistency more than her talent. She showed up prepared and focused, and she listened carefully when others played. During small gatherings, she waited patiently for her turn and thanked those who listened. This behavior earned her quiet respect and made others feel comfortable around her. She never acted as if she deserved attention, and that made people more willing to give it freely. The older woman continued to protect the girl from unnecessary pressure. She declined opportunities that felt rushed or performative and accepted those that allowed space and calm. She understood that growth needed time and that the girl was still learning who she was beyond the piano. This careful guidance allowed the girl to mature without losing the joy that first drew her to music. During one small community event, the girl played again in a modest room with familiar faces. The setting was simple and the audience close, As she played, she felt a sense of recognition not from others but from herself. She realized she was no longer thinking about that first night with comparison or expectation. Instead, she felt present and steady, focused only on the sound and the moment. This realization brought her a quiet sense of independence. After the performance, a few people thanked her and moved on without lingering. The absence of attention felt just as meaningful as applause once had. She understood then that music did not always need witnesses to matter. It could exist fully in the act itself. This understanding deepened her connection to the piano and removed fear from future performances. Her teacher noticed that she handled mistakes with grace. When a note slipped, she continued without tension and corrected it naturally. This calm response reflected her inner confidence and her trust in preparation. The teacher recognized this as a sign of maturity that could not be taught directly and felt proud to witness it develop. At home, the girl began to explore pieces on her own, choosing music that resonated with her emotions and curiosity. She played slowly and thoughtfully, sometimes stopping to repeat a single phrase until it felt right. These moments were not about improvement, but about understanding and expression. They became her way of processing thoughts and feelings she did not yet have words for. The memory of being pulled from the crowd remained part of her story, yet it no longer defined her path. It existed as a reminder of openness and trust rather than surprise. She understood that being ready meant more than technical skill. It meant being willing to step forward when invited and to do so honestly. As she approached new stages in life, she carried this lesson with her. Whether facing unfamiliar rooms or unfamiliar people, she remembered how calm could exist even in uncertainty. That knowledge gave her strength without hardness and confidence without arrogance. The people who once witnessed her first performance remembered it fondly, yet they never claimed ownership over her journey. They spoke of that night as something complete in itself, not as the beginning of a spectacle. This allowed the girl to grow without being tied to a single moment. What continued to unfold was not a dramatic rise, but a steady shaping of character. Music remained her guide, teaching her patience, listening, and presence. These qualities followed her into every part of her life and prepared her for moments still to come. Even before she knew what they would be years later, the girl, now nearly grown, found herself in another room filled with people, though this time she arrived by choice and not by surprise. She was invited to play at a small gathering meant to honor community artists, and the setting felt calm and respectful. As she waited her turn, she noticed the familiar mix of quiet voices and warm light, and it reminded her gently of that earlier night without pulling her backward into it. She felt steady and present, grounded in who she had become. When she sat at the piano, her movements were unhurried and natural. Her feet reached the floor now, and her posture reflected years of practice and understanding. She placed her hands on the keys with the same care she had shown as a child, yet with greater awareness of sound and space. The room settled into silence again, not because of expectation, but because people sensed something sincere was about to be shared. As she played, the music unfolded with clarity and depth, shaped by experience rather than ambition. Each phrase carried intention and restraint, and the sound filled the room without effort. She did not play to impress, and she did not play to relive the past. She played because it felt honest and necessary in that moment. The audience listened fully and without distraction, recognizing the maturity in her presence as much as in her sound. Among the listeners were a few who had been there years before, though time had softened the memory. They felt a quiet recognition rather than surprise. The wonder they felt now was different yet just as real. They saw not a child exceeding expectations, but a person who had grown into her voice with patience and care. That understanding brought a deeper kind of respect. When the piece ended, the silence returned briefly, and then applause followed, calm and appreciative. The young woman stood and acknowledged it with a simple nod. She did not search the room for validation, and she did not feel the need to explain herself. She stepped away from the piano knowing she had said what she needed to say through the music alone. Later, as people spoke with her, she listened attentively and responded thoughtfully. She thanked them and moved on without lingering. She understood now how to accept appreciation without letting it define her. Music was still part of her identity, but it was not her whole story. It was one way she connected and communicated, and that was enough. That night, as she walked home, she reflected quietly on the path that had brought her there. She did not measure success by distance traveled or recognition gained. She measured it by the steadiness she felt and the clarity she carried. The memory of being pulled from the crowd had shaped her, not by pushing her forward, but by teaching her trust in moments that arrive without warning. She realized that what mattered most was not being seen but being ready. Ready to listen, ready to share, and ready to remain grounded regardless of the outcome. This understanding gave her peace and allowed her to move forward without fear of losing herself. The piano had been her teacher in ways no lesson plan could offer. Through sound and silence, it had shown her how to stay present and how to let moments pass without clinging to them. That wisdom stayed with her, guiding her choices and shaping her sense of purpose. As she looked ahead, she felt no urgency to define the future. She knew that when the time came, she would recognize the next invitation, whether it arrived loudly or quietly. And when it did, she would step forward, not because she was pulled, but because she was ready to listen and respond with honesty. The story of that night lived on, not as a dramatic tale, but as a quiet truth carried by everyone who had been there. For some, it became a reminder that beauty can appear without warning and without planning. For others, it stood as proof that attention and kindness can create space for something meaningful to emerge. No one tried to retell it with exaggeration, because its power came from how simple it was. The young woman continued her life without chasing moments that looked impressive from the outside. She made choices that felt aligned with her values and allowed music to remain a steady presence rather than a measure of success. Sometimes she played for others, and sometimes she played only for herself. Both felt complete and valid. She understood that not every meaningful moment needed an audience. The older woman watched her grow with quiet pride and gratitude. She never forgot the responsibility of that first decision to say yes when asked if the girl played. That choice had not created the talent, but it had protected the moment when the girl learned she could share her voice safely. The older woman carried that lesson forward in how she supported others, trusting small openings and gentle encouragement. Years later, when asked about her journey, the young woman rarely mentioned that first performance unless someone else brought it up. When she did speak of it, she described it simply as a moment when people listened. She did not frame it as destiny or turning point. She saw it as one of many moments that shaped her understanding of connection and presence. Those who heard her story often expected a grand conclusion or a clear lesson. Instead, they found something quieter and more lasting. They learned that preparation does not always lead to planned outcomes, but it creates readiness for unexpected ones. They learned that offering space can matter more than offering direction. The piano itself remained unchanged, yet it continued to witness new hands and new stories. It stood as a reminder that instruments do not create meaning alone. Meaning emerges when someone meets them with honesty and care. That truth echoed far beyond music and into how people approach their own skills and opportunities. In time, the details of that evening blurred, but the feeling stayed clear. It was the feeling of a room becoming still together. It was the feeling of being moved without being told how to feel. It was the feeling of recognizing something genuine and allowing it to exist without interference. The small girl who once stepped forward without expectation became a person who understood the value of presence over performance. That understanding shaped her life quietly and steadily. She learned that when she listened deeply and acted with sincerity, she did not need to force moments to matter. And so the story ended not with applause or recognition, but with continuity. A life carried forward with patience, curiosity, and trust. A moment that muted a room and then released it gently back into the world. A reminder that sometimes the most lasting impact comes not from being chosen, but from being ready when the invitation arrives. When the invitation arrives.